Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library, and tonight it is such a pleasure and such a delight to be joined by the wonderful Catherine Barnett and Maureen McLane as they speak about these two brilliant books sitting right in front of me, Solutions for the Problems of Bodies and Space and My Poetics. If anyone is here for the first time, hello, welcome. We're thrilled to have you. We are the oldest, the largest English language lending library on the European continent. We've been in operation for over 100 years, and we host events like this 2 to 3 times per week, so I highly encourage you to look at our program's calendar and see what other speakers we have coming up. Just a couple notes about this conversation. We're going to begin with a reading by both of these brilliant poets. Then we will dive into some questions that I'll be posing, and then finally, after about 45 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions, first from our in-person audience, and if we have time, from our Zoom audience as well. Hello, Zoom audience, inside that camera right there. Thank you for joining us on this rainy evening. So start thinking of your questions now, and finally, once the conversation has concluded, copies of Catherine and Maureen's lovely books will be for sale, thanks to our partner booksellers, Smith & Son. Those will be available just outside, and they may even sign a copy or two if they're feeling generous. So I highly encourage you to purchase them. On to our wonderful speakers tonight. Catherine Barnett is the author of 4 poetry collections, including Solutions for the Problems of Bodies and Space, Human Hours, The Game of Boxes, and Into Perfect Spheres Such Holes Are Pierced. A Guggenheim Fellow, she received a 2022 Arts and Letters Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her work has been published in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Yale Review, The Nation, Harper's, and many other places, and she teaches in NYU's MFA program and works as an independent editor. And joined with Catherine tonight is the lovely Maureen McLane, who is the author of 8 books of poetry, 2 critical monographs on British Romantic poets, and an experimental hybrid of memoir and criticism, and numerous essays. Her most recent books are What You Want, Poems, and My Poetics, an adventure in poetic criticism, and we will be learning what that term means tonight. And she is the Henry James Professor of English and American Letters at New York University. Catherine, Maureen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please, a round of applause. So we'll be starting with a reading. First, Catherine is going to read selections of poems from this beautiful collection, and then we'll be having a joint reading from Maureen's lovely book. So Catherine, it's in your hands.
Hello, hi, this is me. Okay, good. So thank you to Emily, and Emily has asked me to read a few poems, and then Maureen will read some, and then we'll talk. So the first poem, so in this book, I have 10 studies in loneliness that are sort of lyric essays, and I just wanted to say very briefly how they came to happen, which is I was here teaching in Paris, graduate students, and right before the pandemic in January 2020, I gave a talk called The Capaciousness of Solitude, but really I was trying to reassure the students not to be so afraid of loneliness, and that it's a creative force. So I just was trying to persuade them of that. And in order to prepare, I'm a very anxious presenter, and so I wrote, notebook after notebook filled with crazy notes about loneliness. So if you find them after I die, don't take them seriously, because I was really trying to see what could I say, what could be true. Some of these things are true, and some are me very much exaggerating to see what it would lead to. And then I typed them all up. It was 150 pages, and then I went through and underlined the parts that interested me, and then I separated those out, and then I had a big foam board, and I just tacked different parts of the notes up and crafted the essays that way, a strategy I borrowed from Ilya Kaminsky, a wonderful poet. So there are 10 of these studies in loneliness. This is going to be strange. What do you do when you have to turn the page? Just put the mic down? Okay.
Just get creative.
Okay, so this is Studies in Loneliness 1. I understood I was alone, or that I wanted to be alone. right there in the middle of my big family. So I asked to move out of the room I had shared with my 2 baby sisters into a spare room downstairs by the kitchen, where I had for company not the sound of their breathing, but of my father's prized ice machine dropping its tidy cubes automatically all night long. I had for company 4 doors. It was a room of doors. When did loneliness become equal parts strategy, ministration, origin story, addiction? At lunch one hot July day, I said, I love loneliness. That was summers ago. New Year's Eve assignment, go out alone to a bar. The main character in Castaway befriends a volleyball. This is one signature of a lonely person, the personification of objects. Rarely do I practice this, but somehow, without realizing it, I have given my car a female pronoun. I spread blankets across her roof when it hails. And how to answer my mother as we brush her hair, drive her car. She asks, does a human being ever run out of questions? She says, look at all those birds sitting in a row on the fence. Why do you think they like to be together? In one of my favorite Carson McCullers stories, an old man drinks beer in the morning. Abandoned by his wife, he grieves for 5 years until he learns the science of love, which is to start with objects, a tree, a rock, a cloud, and learn to love each one before trying to love a human being. Last week, someone placed an ad on Craigslist. Anyone need a grandma for Christmas? I can cook dinner. We'll bring food and gifts. Some people thought it was a hoax. Some people told her to kill herself. By the time a young man in Tulsa, Oklahoma, tried to find the lonely grandma, his own mother having recently died of cancer, she had removed the post. At least 10% of school children report feeling lonely, either always or most of the time. I always begged my parents to wake me before they left. An old friend gathers petals, leaves, twigs, and stones when she walks her dog. Every day she makes something out of what she found. I was here. No, please. That's fine. Thank you. Emily asked me to read this poem, which is called Untitled, which is kind of a portrait of my mother, and it's about art. The book looks to art as a kind of resource, both making and responding to art against existential loneliness and other kinds of loneliness. So this is just called Untitled. Excuse my voice, I have asthma. Untitled. Isn't it dangerous to hold them in your mouth like that? I asked. The steel T-pins pressed between my mother's lips caught the light from the studio windows. Probably, she murmured. Probably, she says gently to questions I ask every day. Are you hungry? Did you sleep well? Somehow I've been with her a week already, the days passing like voices. The probability of an event happening is a number between 0 and 1. One by one, she removed the pins and tacked up another drawing that looked like a face or a potato, a homely potato edged with light. Object study. Vanitas. To take back east with me, I chose a piece of painted plywood. It didn't weigh much. I tucked it under my arm as we walked slowly up the hill. Neither of us asked the other what to prepare or how. We just stopped at the market and wandered the aisles, filling the basket with perishables. It was getting late. I was in charge, but I couldn't keep time from slipping away. Dinner would be late again. Who knows how long we were there? My mother's beautiful lined face, marked with yellow, black, and red ochre from a day's work, a life's work. I unloaded the cart in a rush and without thinking placed the painting on the conveyor belt. Gold outline, central red omphalos, unvarnished, unframed, unsigned. The tomatoes and apricots ripened imperceptibly as the cashier weighed them. It was all happening so quickly. Matrix codes flickering under the high flickering lights, trained on whatever might get nicked. "What's this?" the cashier asked. She must have pressed a hidden button that slowed the conveyor belt. We stood for a moment in the middle of anodyne space, nothing moving except the old man carrying his bags to the exit and the young families, impatient, starting to fill their carts. My mother once told me painters look backward and forward at the same time. Since then, it's years, and yet feels shorter than a day, and I still don't understand. Or maybe I do. Yes, I cannot do otherwise. 0 is looking backward. 1 is looking forward. Let me not stand here contemplating the diminishing distance between them, but go on with the story, such as it is. There's still time. My flight isn't until tomorrow. I'll wave until she is out of sight. "What's this beautiful thing?" the cashier said again, quietly, looking down at the painting and then back up at us, into my mother's face. I think it will always be my mother's face. And I'll just read one more, and then we'll let Maureen read. We'll hear her voice, and then we'll talk. This is called Thought Experiment. What would it be like to be a mantis shrimp? Poorly understood, territorial, combative, with part of your brain housed in each eye stalk. I don't think it's exactly love, but some species are monogamous, sharing a patch of seagrass or underwater burrow for 20 years. My apartment is probably 150 feet above sea level, and when my son comes back home, he sleeps in his old captain's bed above his old t-shirts. Sometimes he brings his dog, a rescue, and calls me Dogma. Then they're gone again, and I rattle around again, mindlessly, listening to my neighbors sing. From the far end of the galley kitchen, I can watch the Hudson tides rise and fall, can imagine being dredged in a net, dropped by the sloop my son and his classmates sailed long ago when they were still children. I remember looking out the window then, too, watching the clear water make its leisurely way up and back. Was my mind already housed here in my eyes, which, like all human eyes, like to close, to rest, dream, recall a face, a child's voice who is no longer a child? Who knows what else they're thinking about now? True story about the mantis shrimp who shattered her aquarium walls. Because she was alone, or because she was not alone enough. Stories I cannot tell because I don't know how they end and might never understand. Who would buy a mantis shrimp lifted from the seagrass, sent by express mail to be dropped into 1,000 distant aquariums where she swivels her compound eyes and takes everything in? Thank you.
So I want to thank Catherine for allowing me to accompany her as her work has accompanied me over the past several years in wonderful ways, and also Emily for inviting both of us. And so we thought, for my brief reading, it would be companionable. The opening of this book, My Poetics, is a proem in a Q&A, in the form of a Q&A, raising the question, because it's not self-evident, what is poetics, but also what is poetry, and proposing those things as endlessly reopenable questions, as opposed to definitively answerable possibilities. And Catherine was game to do this with me. So we may jump around a little bit and move ahead. But what you'll hear are a series of questions, and the answers are always given from poets. So the answers are all extracts, they're all quotations. And in a way, this is a form I've used before, and I like it very much. And in a way, it enacts part of the commitment of this book, which is to think with and through poems, and that poems are, they're many things, but they can also be invitations to sit with and in them and allow them to move through you. So these are some of the poems that have moved through me, and intermittently there's a critic or a theorist or two popping up as well. So I won't give you the whole cast of characters here, but if you're interested in the Q&A, but most of the quotations are from poets and critics and theorists in an Anglophone tradition, although there are a few French luminaries here and also in the room. So that seemed appropriate. So Catherine is game to be the questioner of this poetic catechism. Oh, sure. Proem in the form of a Q&A.
Why poetics?
My purpose here is to advance into the sense of the weather.
And?
What I have to offer here is nothing revolutionary.
So what is this?
I am not writing anything that anyone has requested of me or is waiting on. Not a poetics essay or any other sort of essay. Not a roundtable response, not interview responses, not writing prompts for younger writers, not my thoughts about critical theory or popular songs.
And yet, poetics?
I was fully aware of the risks involved, that any plausible poetics would be shattered like a shop window, flickering and jagged, all of the wire exposed and sending sharp twists and reversible jolts into whatever it was I was trying to explain or talk about.
But poetics?
It's not that I want to say that poetry is disconnected from having something to say. It's just that everything I want to say eludes me.
And so?
We could make a plan, make something out of apparently nothing.
And so?
I made this up from nothing. It's not myself I sing, or love, or anything that has a source. I dreamed these words while riding on my horse.
What was your first encounter with poetry?
'Twas brillig in the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wabe.
And then?
You'd notice it at grass level when you're a child.
But what is poetry? Is that right?
It is. Let me just check what page. Define definition.
What is poetry?
The difference is spreading.
What is poetry?
It is easier to think what poetry should be than to write it.
What is poetry?
It can be exhausted by no theory, and only a divinatory criticism would dare try to characterize its ideal.
Why poetry?
The world is not enough.
Why poetry?
We are each other's business.
Why poetry?
Because in this time, song holds loss.
Why poetry?
Poetry sheds no tears such as angels weep, but natural and human tears. She can boast of no celestial ichor that distinguishes her vital juices from those of prose. The same human blood circulates through the veins of them both.
Come again?
Oh, an incurable humanist you are.
Did you want me to stop there?
I think that's good.
I think you put your green line, but maybe you wanted me to pick it up there.
Maybe you can pick it up there.
Why poetry?
And then we can go to the very last 2 pages.
Sorry, these are marked, but...
She heard the death bells knelling.
Where are you? Wither Poetics.
Wither Poetics. A lot of it is just trying to figure out how to say something.
And again, Poetics?
By poetics, I mean, in the widest sense, the discursive and figural parameters of the imagination, the terms in which the poem imagines its subject, figures its thought, thinks its figures.
And?
Poetics is a continuation of poetry by other means.
And?
The great silence is full of noises. That's what I mean when I talk about poetics.
Wither Poetics.
Oh, the wind and rain. Oh, the dreadful wind and rain.
And you?
I have learned how to behave, living like a jar for certain preserved insights that unscrolled upon a slender banner, the gentlest form of scholarship, glossing only delicately an unfolding situation that cannot be taught, only experienced, rising among a faint and turning mist off the surface of the river.
Notes to self.
Continue your annotations. Continue your questionings.
Final thoughts.
America, I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel.
Thank you so much. It's just such a pleasure to be able to hear the poetry from the mouths of the poets. So it's really a privilege. Thank you for reading those. And I'm so glad that you could read from these 2 books at the same time, because there's such a resonance in between them, and the resonance is in the asking. Is they're both books of questions. Particularly, you say in the first study of loneliness, you ask the question, does a human being, or your mother asks the question, does a human being ever run out of questions? And the answer seems to be no, as we just saw. But I'd like to interrogate this relationship between poetry and poetics and questioning more thoroughly. First, Catherine, I want you to speak about, insofar as this book, as Solutions to the Problem of Bodies and Space, is a book of questions, of questioning. I want you to speak about the questions you were asking yourself as you embarked upon it, and then I'm hoping you can both speak about where you think poetry situates itself in between the question and the answer. So,
I'm going to answer the second question first. I'm not going to answer it, I'm going to talk about it, because I was just teaching, and a student in the very first stanza mentioned an answer. She was looking for the answer, which was kind of a great strategy, because we didn't know what the question was. And my last book was filled with lyric essays called The Accursed Questions, and it was similar. So I was fascinated by questions, and we were just talking earlier, I think one thing I love about a question is that it invokes an other. Even if you're just writing in your own world and you ask a question, you've made an other. I also think that it's a very sociable act. I mean, I think some people feel interrogated, and I know that's not a good feeling, but I think of a question as a great act of generosity to the other. And it certainly is a way to keep oneself writing, to have the inner and the outer self in conversation. What was the first part of your question?
Well, I'm actually going to go down a different route now, because that's more interesting. So do you think that poetry then resolves the questions that it's asking?
I hope not.
Why?
I mean, I think, we're both deeply enamored with Keats's notion of negative capability and the idea of uncertainty and being irritable, reaching after fact. So I think I would rather be like some of the people I admire the most intelligent people always say, I don't know. And I think that rather than imagining it's so much more rich to not know. When I was in 10th grade, I've told this story before, about, I don't know if this is good or bad. When I was in 10th grade in a public high school in California, the teacher said, "Oh, you're so smart because you know how little you know." And it just stayed with me my whole life. Like, okay, great, I really don't know very much. And I was a journalist before I was a poet, And the problem with that was you kind of had to, there was a lot of questions, and I loved that, but you also were supposed to have answers, whereas poetry, I really think you're allowed not to have an answer. I don't know what you might think.
Yeah, I mean, this opens up so many lines of force, right? Because on the one hand, I was thinking both about how some poems, in a way, model for you or teach you how to keep the questions open. So I think in one precinct of my life, I spent a lot of time with Romantic era poets, British Romantic poets, and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Charlotte Smith, and there's in Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, and it's a very long kind of recovery from dejection kind of classic Romantic ode, kind of big organ, but at the end in the final stanza, he says, not for the more obvious things I raise thanks and praise, but for those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings. And he does this extraordinary thing where he values the difficulty, and he arrives at that in I think it's 11th stanza, the final stanza, and that sense of just a kind of profound acknowledgement of complexity, that one's experience can hold joy and profound sadness and awareness of creaturely life, whether that be trees or birds or other people, but also profound dejection and alienation. And it's such a wonderful poem that way because it kind of follows that emotional itinerary. But that phrase, it always stuck with me because it's a weird, knotty phrase. It's syntactically negative. Not for these I raise, songs of thanks and praise, but for those obstinate questionings. And so I'm, and part of this is just characterological. I think, some of us really like to sit with the obstinate questions or are obstinate about insisting that the questions still stay open. And so it's probably no accident that I responded to that poem. But I also think of, Catherine's, both this book and her previous book had a beautiful sequence called, if I'm remembering correctly, Accursed Questions. And I'm very fond of that. When poets can, when their works can hold questions and tolerate certain kinds of suspense, and so the end of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? ? How are you? Is the answer like, yeah, of course it's not far behind, or is it, oh shit, global warming? Right? So there's this very interesting way in which the question is differently conditioned based on what is in the surface of your mind as a reader, what is in the surface of your mind when you encounter the poem. And I think one interesting way to read Yeats is to go through, and he has so many powerful questions, rhetorically powerful. How can we know the dancer from the dance? And then it's like, okay, can we? If you sit with them, and just that they're partly questions, some questions have the force of riddles. Right, and they kind of, they're like brain teasers, and some questions are more, like Catherine was saying, invitations, and some questions are some poems have questions that are sort of notes to self or self-address, and so I've just been very interested in that all along, and it's one of the things I responded to early on in Catherine's work.
I want to speak as well about practices of citation and of reading in both of your works. Obviously, the Q&A is incredibly citational. You're sort of engaging in such rich dialogue with such a plethora of voices. And Catherine, for you, across Solutions for the Problems of Body and Space, you return to the activity of reading as something which sort of breaks solitude, resists it. So can you talk about, as you are curiously looking into solitude, where does reading situate itself alongside it, against it, with it?
I mean, that's such a good question, and I was an avid reader as a kid, and I was thinking about it recently. I did love all the stories and novels that were fueled by and portraits of loneliness, from Ferdinand the Bull, to Carson McCullers, and when I'm writing now, I was going to ask this of Maureen also. Like the poem I read with my mother has, it's just like one citation after another. There's Dickinson, there's Beckett, there's so many, and it makes me feel very unalone to have those other voices, which are noted in the back. So I just feel in conversation with these people who came before me, and there's other discussions in the loneliness poems about, like, how could you be lonely with a wall of books around you, and all those voices keeping you company. So for me, I love when other voices show up in my poems, especially other literary voices, but even beloveds or whatever. And it's fun reading Maureen. Maureen will speak about it, but I also hear it in Maureen's work, and it was something I was interested in. Do you have the same feeling that it's company for you, or how are your citations, which are so integral, like they're not marked, they just show up?
No, it's a great question. And I guess I think about it along several axes. Sometimes the phrases that are just so embedded in your mind that they occur, as it were, spontaneously. And whether it's phrases from poems, or for some of us it might be pop music, for some of us it might, these bits, these sort of earworms. And for me, I mean, the sort of stickiness of certain lines of poetry has always been kind of a palpable thing in my reading, and then I'm also interested in the sort of rhetoric of citation, and when one does or doesn't, because sometimes, I mean, the footnote can be a really demoralizing thing, and it can also be a really beautiful thing. I have because I write in some different keys, and the sense of, the proper citational forms, and that was actually an interesting discussion with this book, My Poetics, because on the one hand, it's published by the University of Chicago Press, but it doesn't have footnotes, it has endnotes, and so hopefully somebody can walk in and not feel that they're facing a carapace of, really dense footnotes. But I do think that it's such a beautiful, interesting space of companionship, but also arguing, and there can be, so I think sometimes the things I remember are precisely things that irritate me, and then they become a kind of, irritability is also a muse, and I think is slightly under-recognized as a powerful potential goad for writing in a bunch of different keys. But I'm also interested in forms that are generated out of quotation, whether it's the Kento or, say, the Q&A that draws on prior works. So somewhere in one of Catherine's poems, there's this, and I'm gonna misquote it, but it's when you're in a class and asking students, what would you want your work to do for another, and then she asks the question to herself, and one answer is given is that the poems offer company in the void, and I just love that so much, and it just was a kind of, it immediately distilled one thing I both have found in works of art that really matter to me, and also what one hopes one's work might offer. One can also hope that one's work offers disturbance, right? I mean, there are many things to hope for one's work, but this idea that however much it might be grounded in a supposedly personal I, it is also companionable and always secretly socially oriented, or secretly already coming out of different forms of community, whether they be familial or class, or classrooms, etc., or the company of the dead, which is undermarked, particularly in American contexts, because we're such a death-phobic and thanatotic culture, about which I obviously have nothing to say. So.
Do you want to respond to that, Catherine? You were nodding.
No, I just agree. I was just I was just agreeing. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up the I, the poetic I, because that's quite tricky in both of your works. The exact location of the I, of the self, and the sort of tension or schism that exists between the autobiographical I and the I of poetry, the I that is speaking, which is also in tension with sort of the sociability of the works. Catherine, you have this lovely, lovely line where you're proposing that to answer the question, what is a human being, one should stand on one's head, or she should stand on her head and empty herself of I. So this act of self-emptying, which is in tension with a similar but opposite act of self-gathering, which is also the act of making poetry. It's creating an archive of oneself, gathering loved ones around oneself, gathering words. Can you speak to these two different but linked activities of ridding oneself of the I and of gathering the I, making the I through poetry?
I mean, I was speaking about this in class today too, like the I, people often come up to me afterwards, after a reading, and they say, oh, you're so brave, or something, and I'm always a little perplexed because it is from a life, but it still is very much a made thing, so that I is outside the self, and that little line that you quoted is from an Ars Poetica, and I think it's very Keatsian also, like the idea, he says, the poet is the least egotistical thing. I mean, it's not like we are not the least egotistical thing, but I think that we do, we empty ourselves and put ourselves out into the world, even into the inanimate world. And so that attunement, it is part of the self, and it's part of maybe your mirror neurons, the way the brain is working. So it is a self, but it is a self that's also very interested in what is it like for others, and then that might even be collected into that I. So the I is, I think it's confusing because you do want the I to be not totally fabricated, but the I is also, I think for me, it is a kind of Keatsian social I that gathers other shards to it, and that I am interested in speaking from that voice that isn't the actual me, with her lozenges and things.
Maureen, what is the poetic I for you? Where is she?
I feel like I would have a plurality of answers, or a plurality of responses, and I'm interested both in my own work and in others' work when people pivot to a we, and when that happens, and also when when poems activate third-person figures, and I'm interested in some longer poems. Again, some things that are coming to mind are some Romantic era odes. But Coleridge has a long poem called Dejection, an ode, and it's very much you might say wallowing in an abyss of depression and dejection. But what happens in a number of times in the poem is that he addresses someone else. So there's this kind of extraordinary moment where he pivots to, "Oh lady, we receive but what we give." And you see that even in these moments of hyper-accenting of an I, there's also an impulse. These poems, they want to kind of posit an addressable other, and so I'm interested in those moments. And I think in one of Catherine's poem you have this phrase about, am I right, the helpless human cohort? Yeah. And I love that in the sense of that is one horizon that Catherine's work and poets whose work I care about have in view. However much it's coming from a first-person stance, often it's coming, and that doesn't mean that I also might be incredibly specifically inflected, and in all kinds of ways, all kinds of quote identities, but that sense of, and not only, it's interesting too when poets address themselves to the inanimate, or when they, want to be thinking about entanglement beyond species. And so I'm kind of agnostic. I think there's a lot of stuff about, and I hate this discourse, and I hope this isn't a heresy, and but I hate the discourse of voice and finding your voice. I kind of want to murder that discourse, impersonally and nonviolently. Because I kind of feel like, I don't know, find your voice sings, and it doesn't mean, I think some of us, some poets are, they have or it appears that they have a ringing, identifiable voice, and they write in a certain key, and it's really powerful. And then there are other poets who are a little more metamorphic, and again, I'm agnostic about that. I like poets who work in those different modalities. What I'm skeptical of is a kind of monomania about this equals authenticity. I'm like, maybe not, So again, I'm a little. So I like the idea linguistically of thinking about the I as a shifter. Any of us can occupy it, and that's why lyric poetry has a certain charisma of that supposed genre that takes up the I, and yet any of us notionally could walk into it if we wish to.
It's interesting, this idea of the I being something that any of us could walk into and take, because it returns us to something you were saying earlier, Maureen, about the idea of poetry and of one's work as a gift or as an offering, which is something that I was so struck by across Solutions to the Problems, Bodies in Space. There's a concern with transmission and with the idea that you are not writing for yourself but for others. At one moment you say, so many of these words have been used by others, so many of these shoes have been worn by others, I hope to return them eventually for others to wear. So there's that idea that your poetry is not yours but is on loan almost. And Catherine, or excuse me, not Catherine, Maureen, your book is called My Poetics. There's obviously an engagement with the notion of ownership here. So insofar as you're agnostic about the I, I'd like to know as well your thoughts on ownership in poetry, and poetry as a process of transmission or something to be given rather than held onto or possessed.
You want to go first?
Yeah, no, there is something kind of like obnoxiously proprietary about My Poetics, and I actually talk about that a little bit at the beginning of the book. It's a way of not wanting to hide behind a kind of false impersonality. There's a great book about 30 years ago by the American poet and critic Charles Bernstein called A Poetics, and I like that a lot. Instead of like Poetics, the definitive statement, I wanted this to be a kind of provisional thing. On the one hand, it's like, okay, my poetics, yours might intersect. They may be shared, they may not be. So it's offering that more in the spirit of referring it back to me, but not making it legislative for all. It's sort of the way I thought about that. But in terms of transmissibility, and also that things are not in the first or maybe last instance for oneself. I mean, one way I think about this, or I've learned a lot about it from, say, two streams. One, traditional balladry, in that sense. Poetry's by anonymous, which, if you're quantitative, poetries by anonymous are huge, right, in terms of the history of the species. And the wager of a ballad is that anybody can sing it or recite it, and it's not owned, it's passed through and passed on. And a ballad is as alive as anybody does it, And so that sense of a poem as recyclable and refunctionable is a great, it's both really interesting in its own right, and it's a great antidote to the idea of poem as property. So I like to keep both of those in mind. And also, yeah, so these are some of the ways I think about that kind of intergenerational transmission thing, yeah.
Two thoughts come to mind. One is, I teach I'm sorry to talk so much about teaching, and teaching shows up a lot in this book because it is, it's so much part of my conversation, and the permeability, and again, the attunement that is part of my poetics is also part of my teaching. And there's some of my students here. But
Can I read your beautiful quote about teaching as well, where you say, when I teach, I seem to let all 12 hearts beat inside my own? It's
yeah, that sounds a little too sweet, but it's true. It's true. No, because I mean, you're sitting there and like you're aware of everybody, like what that person upset or whatever. My mirror neurons are too active, but we do this a radical revision class, and we actually have students swap work and engage with the other person's work and reuse those lines, but also bring new material. And what's so interesting is I'm always anxious about it because it's such a trespass. And I say, look, don't worry, this is just a trespass, that's what it is. And you're just going to practice so that you can do it on your own work. But what ends up happening is the poet, like if I have your work, in just playing around with it, reorganizing the lines, bringing a little bit of new material, repurposing the lines, I often, I would say 85% of the time, get to something you were trying to get to. Not just me, I'm telling all my students, in this exchange. And so there's this fluidity of identity. And it's a beautiful moment in class because the other person is kind of grateful, like, how did you know that? But it was there, but it was shareable in this other non-proprietary way. So I think that's wonderful. And the other thing I just wanted to say briefly, I'm a huge Beckett fan, and your question made me think, and even Helpless Human Cohort probably comes right from Beckett's Not I, and I don't know if you've listened or watched that, but it's so terrifying. You could see Billy Whitelaw's, it's just her mouth, at 13 minutes, a cry, someone in great distress who cannot express the distress. But off stage, and I've never seen this because I've never seen it in real life, there's someone called a helpless human auditor. Maybe it's even compassionate human auditor. And helpless compassionate human auditor, something like that. But the gesture that auditor makes is just this. It's just like, just goes like this. Which seems to me kind of my poetics also. Like, I'm just a witness. Yeah, maybe I witnessed from the self and I watched my father die. So that's the material, but it is sort of like, it's just a helplessness and an accompanying of the other lives, even if it is still through the little visions that I have in my, the worlds I pass through. So I think those two things have to do with both presence and absence, presence and, mutability or permeability.
Can we have a round of applause for Catherine and Maureen, please? I have not been inspired by the spirit of giving, and I have taken up a lot of time, so we have limited time for audience questions. But we'll start now with the in-person audience. Raise your hand very high if you have a question, and Alfonso, I believe, will bring you a microphone. Yes, he will. So go ahead and go quick, because I've been greedy. And don't be shy. Someone always has to go first.
Hi, it's on. Thank you so much for your readings. I wanted to say, it made me think, I'm rereading Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, but he has this quote about writing's obituary and poetry's obituary, and he says, maybe, in fact, we will soon be the threatened disciples of a catacomb religion, uniting in secret away from public prosecution and punishment, to celebrate damned masses of writing, to communicate by sharing texts otherwise impossible to find or objectionable. Are computers the harbingers of such perdition? And I wanted to ask, in this horrible I think it's horrible, digital age we're in, and AI is writing things, how do you think poetry and poetics can or do resist that? I don't know that I phrased the question very well, but...
Well, it does, your question makes me think of and I may misquote this, and if I do, then Antoine Compagnon can correct me, but where he glosses, he says, poetry equals the practice of subtlety in a barbaric world. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's a very interesting, it sort of rhymes in a sense with Glissant's forecast, but I also think of something else, another phrase, the death of literature and its survival in the poem. So, yeah, I kind of share your misgivings, but I also have a real skepticism about ready-made defenses of art, literature, the humanities. I find most of them a little tragic and completely colluding with instrumental logics of art is good for this and reading novels makes you human, and I'm like, no, it doesn't. So again, I just want to open up that space of complexity where And I do think this sense of holding spaces open where one isn't at every moment being programmed is something I find just increasingly urgent. But where people are finding that space for something a little more open, it doesn't seem to me it would necessarily only be literature. So, again, a couple micro responses, if not answers.
I'll just say very quickly, there's such a history of play and almost like Oulipian play or, Flarf. There's all kinds of art that came out of machine thinking and rearranging. So I am terrified of AI in some ways. I don't read all the terrifying articles, but I am a little worried, and I'm worried about in the classroom because I don't really know what to do when I feel that it's showing up there. But I also think we do have a history of trying to get out of our little minds and do some other operations on art. So that seems like kin to some kinds of artificial intelligence. So I don't really know. I don't really have a good answer. But thank you for that question. I think.
Thanks. As a non-poet, I just was very curious, almost a chicken and egg kind of question with the Q&A. What was the mode of composition there? Did you have the questions and then you found the quotes, or did you just find all these quotes that you loved and then shoehorn questions around them? I just thought it was such an interesting, and obviously the humor of why poetics? But I was wondering, did you have the questions first and then looked for the quotes, or vice versa?
That's a great question, and I think it was a little recursive, so it's a little both chicken and egg tag teaming. I mean, I definitely I knew I wanted to have a way where people could walk into something, and also to introduce this question, thinking with and through poems. I knew I wanted to do that. I had done this in a previous book, My Poets, and I knew it just felt like it opened things up rather than having a kind of more standard, this book is about blah, 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 So, and also, these seem to be very both foundational kinds of questions that a reader might have, right? And that the book was also raising. So, and as you heard, they're very much repeated. So, but it is the case too that I took it as an opportunity.
And so
Exactly. To offer people early on some snippets of works that would show up later in the book. So it was also, I thought of it almost as an overture. Here are some motifs. So some things I knew I want, and some of it was just playing around, because there are a whole bunch of things we skipped over, which was, you as a poet, and with these sort of grand, kind of braggadocious kind of statements that I got from, say, Eileen Miles or other, there's fabulous statements about, what they wanted their poetry to be. So, both. Thank you for the question.
Other questions in the room? We have time for one more. Make it special. No pressure. Yes.
Okay. Your attitude towards questions for both of you is really, really positive. But questions can be really awful and intimidating and nasty. And that's so what do you do with that side of questioning, which is not exactly sweet?
That's what I meant by interrogation, and it can be a power issue. It hardly occurs to me that that's the case, but I know it is. And I've been the subject of questions that I can see there's all kinds of ulterior motives. And so I don't know what you mean, like, what do I do in my life? I just think, well, that's not my friend. But it probably does not come in like that kind of, I liked when Maureen said about irritability and things like that. I don't think I write so much. I would like to write out of anger and rage because I feel it a lot, but I don't know how to make something out of it yet. So in some ways, I think even that question is a good question, but a question that might be more seeking power or to harm. It just probably wouldn't. It hasn't yet come into my poetry because some of those. I seem more to be on the melancholy scale, and rage is super, like I just heard this young woman, she could really write out of rage. I know you're not asking that exactly, but kind of in the sense that a question being a negative force. So I wouldn't know, it hasn't yet come into my natural writing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. A great observation and a question about questions. And I think often the way I have navigated that and not often hypermarked it in writing, but what's happened is things I've experienced as hostile questions, they end up transformed as something I'm parrying in the work. It's something I'm entertaining. It's like, why do you spend so much time doing X? Why do what's the value of this? Or, oh my God, another poem, right? And I feel like, okay, that might be, that might be meant as aggressive and hostile, but that is also a legitimate question. So I want to sit with that more, and so I think that that's been important, and kind of staying with the question in that sense. But I think some things too are part of it is assessing where is the question. Are they good faith questions? I don't like to be. Certain, questions there, if you can't metabolize them, they're sort of telling you something that's still unresolved for you. So I try to kind of tolerate that, but I tend not to, as much as I might, have various arias about why irritability and rage are really important. They're not the emotional wells I tend to draw on when writing, but I also feel like they can be there too as a way of responding, particularly in critical prose. If I think something, I don't like it when things have been, I don't like unearned, I don't even like earned knowingness. I don't like knowingness, and I feel like that's a kind of professional deformation of academics because you are the one who is supposed to know, right? That's, so I also will not abandon expertise. I will not abandon, I feel like I admire people who have, really made themselves, experts in things. I am just endlessly learning. So I feel like there's this sort of semi-dialectical relation to these things, and how I want to be open to questions and yet not abject before them, even if they are meant to abject me. I don't know, yeah.
Can we have a final round of applause, please? This is such a delight. You're both so brilliant. So thank you so much for appearing here at the American Library tonight. And thank you everyone in person and on Zoom who joined us. I hope you'll look at our programs calendar and see other upcoming events that might interest you as well. As I said before, copies of these marvelous books are now available for purchase just outside, thanks to Smith & Sons. You can get a signed copy, take it home with you, find out where all those wonderful citations came from at the beginning, find some more questions to ask and perhaps not answer. So thank you both so much again. I hope you'll have a lovely evening, and I hope to see you soon. Good night.